Thanks, Rachel. Great to be here today. Great to talk to all of you. My talk is going to be an overview of tech and internet policy, and there's a lot in here. So I get very excited about what I do too. Please forgive me if I start to talk really fast. Please raise your hand at any time if you didn't catch something, if you just want me to try to explain something again. There will also be time for questions and so forth at the end. But I'm excited to be here to talk to you about the many, many different issues that go into the work that I do, the work that I've been doing for my entire career around shaping public policy and regulations and law around technology and the internet, and how to try to do that in a way that makes this in such important socioeconomic engine a force for good instead of the force for bad that all too often it is. Let me tell you a little bit about Mozilla for anyone who doesn't know. Mozilla is the organization best known, I think, for the Firefox web browser used by hundreds of millions of people all around the world. We are, as probably some in this room know, but is not widely known, at the top of the corporate structure, the 501c3 Mozilla Foundation, registered nonprofit organization. I work for the corporation arm of Mozilla. This is all a bunch of lawyer speak, but the important point of this here and how we show up and how we come to positions on these tech policy issues reflects both our presence as a competitive business trying to deliver a good product to our hundreds of millions of users, and as an organization dedicated to making the internet better. So I have the very rare luxury in the policy world of leading my team to set positions on issues like net neutrality and privacy and competition, with the ultimate end of advancing the Mozilla mission to make the internet better, to make it more open, to make it more grounded in and built around users and all that other stuff. So you will see plenty of my ideology as I talk about these slides. I'll try to give a balanced picture as well so you can understand the stakes that are at play in each of these issues. But I wanted you all to know where I'm coming from before you start hearing me try to frame your brains around these very technically, legally, and politically complex issues. So where do we start? This is the cover of the November 17th issue of the New York Times Magazine. And if you can't read that green on blue on the projector, it says, "So the internet didn't turn out the way we hoped." I think most of us would agree with that sentiment. I certainly live and breathe it every day. We've taken this really powerful technology and created some pretty terrible outcomes. And I'm not just talking about ubiquitous privacy violations, surveillance, lack of trust. I'm talking about rampant racism, sexism, abuse, attack, misinformation, manipulation, undermining truth, and leading to real-world significant harms, like unvaccinated children, feeding mercury to children with autism, and literal genocide. And economically, we've disrupted these traditional industries, traditional livelihoods left and right, and consolidated wealth into a very, very few people. We've got some work to do. So before I get into the subset of issues here, I want to make you all talk a little bit. Shout out or raise your hand might be better in this room. I think let's do some hand raising. What do you see as the threats to the internet and the tech ecosystem today? What problems are you worried about, and what do you think we need to be working hardest to fix? Great. Net neutrality, disinformation. Great. Give me a couple more, people. Perfect. Back in the back. Security, financial information. That's a great one. Yeah. Child protection. That's great. Identity theft is great. Power centralization, absolutely. Yeah. Algorithmic bias, algorithmic accountability, insert your word here. That's absolutely right. I have a side note on that, which I'll probably get to, but as one of the still rare but growing number of former computer scientists working in the policy space, I have a pet peeve around how policymakers use the word algorithm. A few of them get it. Most of them, y'all are a good audience. I didn't even get to the punchline yet. Most of them use the word algorithm as a synonym for black magic. Read that. Like, the next time you see algorithm in any speech from any politician, like, you can substitute this in. It works incredibly well. So bottom line, these are all significant problems. There are many significant problems that even you didn't get to because we all are thinking about a few of them, and it's just a rich, broad set of problems. But from my point of view, like, the internet is burning. We have to figure out how we can make traction here. And fixing the problems of the internet today is really hard. It's never right and wrong. It's never a simple choice. And speaking to the data ethics frame and theory here, it's not just easily reduced to ethics. You can't train engineers at tech companies on ethics and have any real hope that these deep, systemic, structural problems are going to be addressed. Now, ethics helps. Ethics is helpful. And if we trained engineers to be thoughtful, to have ethics and understanding and context in what they did, That would help. It would improve responsiveness to problems, because we see a lot of companies today that are just minting so much money. Why do they care about these social problems that they're creating? It would improve how we allocate resources as a society. I think there's a lot that can be done, but we can't just provide ethics training. We can't rely on anything self-regulatory from this industry to address the vast majority of these problems. So we have to pursue some really substantial changes to the laws and the rules that govern how technology is built and used. And we need to do that with a really deep understanding of how the technology works. We need policymakers to get it. That's been a line in my LinkedIn bio for like 10 years. We need to help them get it. That's a weird kind of a phrase, but we need government to pass good laws. We need good government. We will not get to the future of the internet we want with no government or with bad government. We need to figure out a way to get to good government in order to pass the kinds of frameworks that we need. So why do we do technology policy? Let me give you a little bit of Mozilla's history here. I have been at Mozilla for quite some time now. Several years before I was at Mozilla, so 10, 12 years ago, I think the organization would have been fairly characterized as techno-libertarian, as subscribing to the original John Perry Barlow theory, where the internet can build itself and government just gets in the way. And all we need to do is get government out of the way and get the engineers together, and they'll solve problems better than laws could. That's not reality. We have learned that that's not the case, both because governments won't stay out of the internet. There's too much money, there's too much power. Governments are going to shape the internet to their own ends, whether we like it or not. And that's not the right view. That's not the right view for how we can get the best out of this ecosystem. So this was in the talk abstract, but it's a favorite line of mine, and I like to say it to get it stuck in people's heads. I went to law school because of Larry Lessig as much as anyone else. I was a computer science PhD student, engineering, doing my research, and reading a bunch of Larry Lessig books in the early 2000s. And his Code 2.0, his way of talking about law and technology and how they intersect to govern the ecosystem and to govern our experience as users and creators of technology, was very powerful to me. But now I riff on it and I say, yes, code is still law. The technology choices that are made, the policies that are made, shape a lot of our experience of the internet. But law is law too. And the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR out of the EU, and some of the other high-profile legal developments we've seen over the past few years are really making this a deeply felt reality, even more so than it was when I started at Mozilla. And if you do it right, if you think about these things in the right way together, if you think about how to shape technology and how to shape law as complementary pieces of an organization, especially an organization like Mozilla, but there are many others represented by many people in this room that have the same kind of ability to combine these two things, you can make them mutually reinforcing and you can gain more out of them by thinking about them together, especially in some complex space like artificial intelligence, where both the technology and the law are incredibly complicated. And we really do, I think, have to think about them together to understand and articulate the outcomes that we want and the pathway that we need to take to get there. So the 2019 reality of why do we do policy, we have to. This is back to my point. Governments are not going to let go, especially in Europe, but increasingly in the United States as well. There is no tech without tech policy. That time will never come again. The halcyon days of the internet, the honeymoon period of the internet, it's over. The Obama administration had a very friendly relationship with Silicon Valley and tech companies. That was a time period where big tech could do almost anything it wanted, and it knew that it was just generating so much good for the United States in particular that it could get away with it. And sure, Europe was making noise, but the US was what mattered, and the US gave all the thumbs ups to tech. That time period is done. Europe is more powerful, shaping more. The US is fed up with big tech companies too. Pretty much everyone in the world who doesn't work at a big tech company is fed up with big tech companies right now. At least it feels that way to me. So J.P. Barlow's death of the role of governments in cyberspace it's a point in history now, rather than anything that reflects 2019. So public policy is my chosen lens for engaging with government and helping to try to shape these laws and regulations. So what does it take? This is a slide that I gave. I built a framework here to help people understand the skills involved in being a good public policy professional. So for the students here, or the people who are not in policy but thinking about policy, or for the people who are working in my field already. Over my experience, I've built this out as a way of helping to grow the people who I manage into more and more powerful and effective policy people. It's a unique mix of hard and soft skills, I think, but it's one that helps hit at this nexus point of technology and writing and analysis and politics and messy human-driven politics and power and how we shape all of these things. So I'm not going to walk through these, but I am happy to make this deck available, or we can talk to Rachel, or people are taking notes and pictures, which is great. Please do that, and please feel free to ask me questions if you have any, but I don't want to take everybody's time to walk through it when I have a lot more material to cover. So let's talk about the issues now. I'm going to give a high-level overview of the universe of tech and internet policy from the advocate's point of view. It's a very rich, broad set of issues. That's why I chose this field. For my career, want to make sure that whatever I'm working on now, I'm working on something different in a couple of years. I get professionally bored really easily. Policy is a great field for me because it has so much of this to it. So if there's something that you want to drill in more deeply, because I'm going over it too quickly, just know you can ask a quick question now, or we can talk about it more when I'm done with the talk. But do, as I said before, please interrupt me if there's something that you missed, because I'm sure you're not the only one. So I will have a breakout slide for each of these, but let me give you a sentence about each of them now. Privacy, I mean, I could talk for hours just on privacy. It's a very well-known issue, a very rich issue. And when I use the term privacy, I think about it as privacy with respect to corporate actors. What's your privacy for your data and how that's used in commercial environments, how that's used by companies of different forms, how it's collected and profiled and used to gain a better understanding of you, generally to market products to you, to get you to click something, to try to force you to do something in a way that has generated so much money, and money that has been used sometimes for some very, very good and valuable things, but against a backdrop where we just don't really feel empowered. So I'll talk about the policy lens to that in a second. Cybersecurity, sometimes you can just say security. I personally fought the phrase cybersecurity for a long time because cyber as a prefix does not really have a technical basis. It comes more from the world of science fiction than from technology. I've given in on that. I just call it cybersecurity now because it's a shorthand that has just become so adopted. I will continue to refuse to say cyber as a standalone word. And all due respect to the many brilliant people at Stanford, they have like a Center for Cyber Policy that's hired some very bright people, and I can't get over it yet. I'm sorry. Anyway, the world of cybersecurity gets to the data theft problems that were mentioned earlier in that set, as well as just the lack of security that so many of us feel when we engage online, businesses that we engage in online, when you send messages to people. Cybersecurity captures a large set of these problems. It includes encryption and the role played by encryption in securing your traffic on the internet, your data and your communications. And finally, government surveillance. Distinguished from corporate surveillance, which I tend to put in a privacy bucket. Plenty of people use the term surveillance to include both government and corporate. So that's why I called out government surveillance specifically as an issue. And there's a lot that's in that, including things like governments more and more requiring data localization mandates, forcing data about their citizens to be stored in their country so that they have more power over it at the government layer. But as I said, I'll go into each of these just a little bit more. So privacy is one of the biggest ones right now. I mentioned the GDPR earlier. This is the foundational law from the European Union that sets out limits on what legal grounds can be used by a company to collect your data and to use it, and what purposes it can be used for. It set a new global standard, unlike anything that had ever come before it when it was passed into law a few years back and took place in legal effect last year. GDPR has changed the way law looks at technology, not just in privacy, but I think full stop across this set of issues. And we see the effects of that in the California privacy bill that was passed last year that will take effect in January. We see the effects of that in Kenya, where a data protection bill was passed last week, modeled after the GDPR, and designed to try to create legal parity with what the Europeans are doing, both to protect the Kenyan citizenry and to create a better economic relationship between Kenya as a leader within Africa and the European Union. The GDPR is, by American standards, not a perfect law. It's a little bit vague. It's going to leave a lot of room for interpretation by data protection authorities who are the individual like FTC-like enforcers within Europe. But it is a good law, and I'm very glad that it was passed. We have more that we're going to have to work out on how it will be applied, but it has more significance than maybe anything else I will talk about. So that's why I wanted to spend a little bit of good time covering it and talking about the politics of it. Consent and notice and choice is sort of the framework that the American regulatory establishment in particular has held towards privacy, towards how companies can collect and use your data online. The theory here is if they provide you with notice about what they're doing, via privacy policy, via a little banner on your screen, something else, you have the choice. You can choose to accept that Facebook is collecting all this information on you and profiling you, or you can choose not to use Facebook. This model has some problems, but it has been the basis for a very long time. So it's part of the reason why Mozilla and many other organizations are pushing the federal government in the United States to pass a baseline privacy or data protection bill. We won't be able to pass something quite as strong as what California has done at the federal level, but having something that says just a notice and choice framework doesn't matter. So in Mozilla's privacy blueprint that we published last year, we called on federal law to adopt a specific, granular, and revocable consent obligation. So that's different from notice and choice. If you have to have specific understanding of what data is being collected and what use it is being collected for at a granular level of detail, and you have to be able to go in and revoke that consent at will, that changes the power dynamics a bit. So we'll see if we can get there, but that's what we're pushing for, just to give you a sense of how this privacy legal landscape is evolving. The U.S. vision I mentioned a little bit. So two other pieces of that. Purpose limitation is a wonky sounding phrase, but it's actually a really, really important one. And the illustrative example of this for me is Facebook. Facebook actually provides a lot of illustrative examples in the privacy conversation. In case you didn't notice that, Facebook had a very one of their many bad news cycles of the past couple years. They collected people's cell phone numbers for a security purpose called two-factor authentication, so that when you log in, you put in your password, they say, hey, is that really you, or did somebody steal your password? Send a text to your phone, you enter in the little code, we've all done this. Facebook doesn't have an internal mechanism to say, we collected that phone number only for two-factor authentication. So they slid it into your profile, and suddenly they started adding that to the database of information that you were being used to have ads marketed to you. You did not provide your phone number for that purpose. And a purpose limitation as a legal principle says Facebook will tell you what purpose they are collecting the data for, and they will limit their use of that data to that purpose. That's one of the fundamental principles that I think we still need to fight for in the US and in many countries around the world. Data minimization is a philosophy that Mozilla has embraced throughout our history. It's one of the reasons why, as an organization, we're free to be so aggressively supportive of privacy law, because we have always adopted the philosophy of collect the data that you need and get rid of it when you don't need it anymore. Seems like an obvious concept, right? But it's exactly the opposite of the culture of Silicon Valley for so long, which was collect all the data, keep it forever, so that you can find new ways of monetizing it later. That clash is being resolved right now in Washington and a whole host of other places. And it's going well so far, at least normatively. Obviously, the legal fight's messier, but that's where we are. So there's a lot of other issues that have come up in the privacy space. Right to be forgotten, or the right of erasure, is a big concept in Europe. The principle of this makes a lot of sense, right? Can you, if some news article is written about a conviction, you got convicted of something criminally, conviction ends up getting overturned. That article about your conviction hangs around for a long time. Somebody does a Google search on you, they find, hey, this person was arrested. It makes sense as a matter of principle that you should be able to say, hey, I need that to go away. It wasn't true. Here's my rationale for so forth. Technically speaking, implementing this is really, really hard. Really hard. And the cross-border implications and principles and so forth of it make it really messy. So I don't have an easy answer on the right to be forgotten question or concept. It comes up in Europe, and it comes up in Europe because there was a major case in France that was resolved earlier this year where a French court tried to expand its right to be forgotten authority extraterritorially. The French court tried to say Google had to take information down from its search engine in the United States pursuant to French law. And as you might imagine, these kinds of cross-border legal challenges are really, really thorny, and something that I personally am going to be dedicating a lot of my next several months to, just because I don't even know where to begin with a hard question like that. But that's where privacy conversations are heading. In the US, the biggest political challenge right now is preemption. We have a good California privacy bill. We have a federal privacy bill that is getting some amount of support because there are people who want it to legally preempt or render moot and ineffective the California bill. So it makes sense if you're a data-hungry company. You don't like the California bill. Hey, feds, pass a stronger one so that I don't have to follow this one anymore. Turns out the California members of Congress don't like that. They want to continue to protect the rights of California citizens as protected under the California bill. So we're having a big fight in Congress over preemption, and when we figure out a political compromise to that makes sense, we will unlock federal privacy bill. I have no idea whether that's going to be 1 month or 5 years, probably somewhere in between. But I can't narrow down the timetable because it's a tough issue. So for the record, Mozilla's privacy framework called for a very narrow form of preemption that essentially said, if you pass a good enough bill, then you can preempt. It's a little hand-wavy, but we can figure out a way to make it work once we get the politics set up. That's all the privacy issues. Any quick questions on that before I move on to cybersecurity stuff? I got one. Sure.
Do you see any potential basis for say several years down the line have your iPhone that you can hopefully select what is being shared, turn it off, turn it on, to have some kind of personal data file that you can always update? And are there tech people who could be working in government kind of bringing those skills of Silicon Valley that developed all that technology, but bringing that into government?
So the tech skills into government, I'll separate out a little bit. It's an interesting question in of its own right. But your first question, I think, is exactly the right one when we think about what a better future looks like in this sense, right? A world where you have like the Apple or the iPhone or the Android. I'm an Android user, but the Android like individual settings that you can control for each of your apps is an ecosystem that has gotten much better over the past few years. You have a lot more power than you used to at controlling some of the things that the apps on your devices can do. Can we get there with all of the data that's collected and used about us? Maybe, right? We could design dashboards that allow you that kind of understanding of what's going on. The reality is, even if we build that kind of technology and offer it, 99% of the people will not use it, right? It's going to be hard to imagine actually making sense of thousands and thousands and thousands of toggles of all of the data that you have. So that's part of the solution, but another part of the solution is eventually going to be intermediaries that do this work for you. So imagine having all of those thousands and thousands of toggles and then being able to delegate to the Electronic Frontier Foundation or Privacy International in London or Mozilla. Set these for me. Give me the medium privacy setting. Set these by default to something that I trust you to calibrate, and then do that at scale. That's where we're headed eventually. I'll move on to cybersecurity, and happy to take questions at any time. Just raise your hand. So cybersecurity, as I indicated, big set of issues. I'm going to give a shout out to some of the work that I did a few years back at Mozilla. We ran a security research project. We called it the Cybersecurity Delphi. It was modeled after something called the Delphi process that was created by the RAND Corporation in the mid-20th century. Just for the research nerds in the room, as I'm sure there are some, we tried to make a relatively blind, merit-driven way of getting different experts from different perspectives to all talk about and offer answers to the same question while keeping their names and identities blind. So it was the strength of their words that spoke and not the strength of their CVs. Because anytime you try to put people in a discussion room, their presence and frankly their gender and their race as well as their CV influence the conversation quite a lot. So we tried to abstract that all out and have a conversation among cybersecurity experts prompted with the top level goal of what can governments do to improve cybersecurity outcomes. So that turned up three things that we called in our report the cyber elephants, the sort of kind of obvious things that were being discussed pretty widely in 2014 when this report was winding down. Encryption, invest in better encryption, better use of cryptography and encryption to secure communications, big one. Encourage more information sharing. Information sharing was a hot topic in policy circles a few years back, kind of got just sort of settled so you don't hear about it as much anymore. But it was hard for a little while for companies to share threat information about specific technical attacks with each other to help others learn. And we actually won an ecosystem where when Google or IBM or Amazon with their giant infrastructures and their very well-resourced cybersecurity defense units, when they see a targeted like giant attack coming in from some foreign nation state, we want them to share that. We want them to share enough about that so that a smaller company who's probably also being targeted, because these attacks tend to target many people all at the same time, we want to encourage that. Anyway, that was one of the things that came out of this report. I don't want to rabbit hole too much on that. And then finally, securing critical infrastructure. This has been a huge issue in the cybersecurity community for forever. We have computers controlling dams on rivers and water and sewage plants and electrical plants that are running like Windows 95. Maybe it's not quite that bad, but they're definitely running Windows XP, which has been deprecated by Microsoft and doesn't get security updates anymore. Like the state of computer control of infrastructure in this country is atrocious. So anyway, the report highlighted the incredibly difficult, incredibly resource expensive problem of trying to fix that, and so it is. The fourth thing, and the thing that was most interesting that came out of that report, was that we should have governments encouraging more security and more investment in open source software. Open source software is such a powerful contributor under the hood to every piece of software and service you use online. And we underappreciate that, and we under-resource it. And it's like, I speak from an open source organization. Everything Mozilla produces, Firefox browser, everything else is all open source. We're big believers in the open source movement. We also know that most open source developers don't have hundreds of millions of dollars in budget and revenue a year like we do. So how do we help that? How do we help secure that? It's a project that's far bigger than us. The part that we can do is we put about $500,000 a year into paying for audits for widely used open source libraries that have never been audited before, and then find a little bit of money to pay as well for the problems that are found to be fixed. In case that hobbyist needs to be able to take a break from their day job to fix it, we'll help cover the remediation cost of that as well. So we're happy with that work, but obviously a lot more needs to be done. And it's important for the security of the internet, and there's a role for governments to play in helping with that. So anyway, I talked about encryption a little bit, but just to put it back into the government lens, not only do governments around the world rarely help encryption, they far more actively work to weaken it. There is a very troubling bill in Australia. It's a law now. It was passed last year. There's a law in Australia that sets up the capability for governments under certain circumstances to set up backdoors, mandatory backdoors into secure communications. We hear this dance with the DOJ in DC about once a year. It started with the last administration and continues through this one. Every now and then law enforcement says, there's too much security, there's too much encryption. We can't see what people are doing. We can't do our jobs. We need to break open all that. We need to get some magic golden key that allows us to decrypt that encrypted messaging software, but not the bad guys. You can imagine how I feel about the technical reality of that proposal. It's a fight we always have to fight, and it's a long-term fight, not a short-term fight, and it's a long-term fight that requires the frame and the concept of encryption to stop being associated in people's heads with people who have something to hide. And we all need to embrace and understand that encryption is part of what makes the internet work. So there's a long-term public research component there that I've got some irons in the fire to help try to address, but I just wanted to put that in context. Standard for software development. So we expect companies to build secure software, but if they don't, what do we do about it? The law is not great here. What we have is there's a case from the Federal Trade Commission, Wyndham, for the Wyndham hotel chain. There was an FTC action against the hotel chain for just drastically awful security practices for their data and their infrastructure. The FTC came in and said, this is completely unacceptable as a matter of consumer protection. The FTC has broad consumer protection law, and won in court. So we have one court case that says if you are as bad as Wyndham was at securing your data, you can be held legally responsible. We don't know what the right line is. And frankly, this is an area where the law has limits. Governments are not going to be able to sit down and articulate in law this standard for security, right? It's a harder problem than that from a public policy perspective. The policy problems where you can say, company do this or don't do this are the relatively easy ones compared to cybersecurity. A lot of what we'll talk about in artificial intelligence, and well, what you'll talk about the whole weekend in artificial intelligence, where it's impossible to set out a durable, sustainable standard in law for what good means. You have to have a more engaged and more reactive process in that, where government can look under the hood at the processes, at the responsibility, at the accountability that companies are doing. So we see that a lot in terms of standards for software development and how hard it is as a problem space, but how important, because if we don't have secure software, we don't have security. Bug bounties and government vulnerability disclosure. This is the most active policy issue that my team is working on around the world. So bug bounties, companies pay a certain amount of money when someone comes to them with a solution, a known vulnerability. So if there's a vulnerability in our code, we don't know about it, we want to know about it. We pay bug bounties to people who want to come and report it to us, as many do in the industry. What happens when a government finds that vulnerability? When the Israeli government or the German government or the US government or the Canadian government finds a vulnerability in Firefox? Well, if it's a good one, they're going to have some incentive to keep it so that their intelligence services, their law enforcement services can, the next time some bad guy is using Firefox for their secure communication,
or Tor, the only browser which is secure encrypted communications services, if not the most in the world. Tor's browser product is based on Firefox. So we do know instances where the government has found a Firefox vulnerability that was also present in Tor and has kept that and then used it to find somebody doing unspeakably illegal things with their technology. But they've done that by pointing out the vulnerability that we know about that would reflect things. Now, this is a tricky one, because I think it's untenable politically to say every time government finds a vulnerability, they should tell the vendor. There is some amount of that hope that we have to allow over, because at some point we do have to give them the tools. It's also a political counterweight to encryption factors. So if government keeps a couple of vulnerabilities that let them get into Apple devices, get into Android devices, get into Firefox, get into Windows, get into Office 365, if they have a few of those, they don't have as much reason to push for encryption factors. So there's a bit of a complicated trade-off. But what we can do is ask for government transparency. So we pushed for years to try to get the US government, we pushed there first, we're pushing it here next, global policy team, global agenda. We pushed for the US government to issue regular reports on how it was handling these. Disclose the number of vulnerabilities that you have about technical issues on. Disclose the number you chose to share with the vendor. Disclose the number that you count. And create responsible governmental processes where there are different actors who are not just the intelligence sources, but also economic, foreign policy, civil rights, various ways. Get these different arms of government to the table together to decide whether you need to tell Mozilla about that and try and Firefox vulnerability, or whether it's okay to keep it for a few months. Big secretary. I'm going to move on, but any questions before you? Questions you can save moments. I've got two good questions.
Can you talk a little? Can you talk a little bit more about that, and how you kind of unite your ideas around that? To me, that sounds like allowing them to keep a backdoor. When we talked about how bad backdoors were at the beginning and how you would protect that from falling into the wrong hands.
A little bit less dangerous than backdoors in a couple of ways. Number one, that they're sometimes very specific in how to execute them. Like sometimes the only way you can effectively take use of a vulnerability like that is terrorism, physically, still in respect. I think it's the assumption or the recognition that the vulnerability is a point in time thing that exists. Vulnerability is also going to exist. And the government will for a very short period of time, 3 months, and then report it. The backdoor is meant to be something that is built and maintained and sustained in perpetuity and hangs around for years. And so that is a very, very different risk for us. So go to the office of the Chinese government or some other unfriendly government or some unfriendly corporate actor or some hacking group finding that same vulnerability. If it's a short time period, you want to know to do that. If it's a 5-year encryption backdoor window, you're going to years. And someone will exploit that for purposes. That's a good question. You have questions about that?
Thanks. I was just wondering about efforts to strengthen base policies like the U.S. Patriot Act so that they can be responsible data sharing across countries, for example, and if there's any work that's being done on that. So if you're thinking of health policy research, for example, and Canadians will not put any data or use data portals that are American-based because the U.S. Patriot Act is so...
That's a good example. I wasn't thinking about that. But I don't know. I mean, the Patriot Act is always under consideration. There are that coherent and policy process right now. It's sensitive as the Patriot Act. But I do think that we need to have mechanisms to facilitate that kind of cross-national sharing. I would look more to privacy data protection law than to government-specific surveillance authorities as a way of trying to facilitate that communication, but to each their own and see how that can be a question.
Yeah, I was wondering if I can go with that.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know if it's TLDR, but why it's hard.
What's a TLDR? Why it's like technically hard to build something that you can like verify that only certain parties use versus like having to have like this revolving door of like, oh, there's a patch, we'll leave it on patch for you, and then I don't know, it just seems inefficient.
Yeah, that's a longer conversation. That's probably not it's a fair conversation. I'm not the best person to answer for either. My technical knowledge is never going in that direction, but it generally relates to the complexities, right? And the ability to reverse engineer even close source products to be able to figure out that information flows go, how it's relatively easy to reconstruct what that secret vulnerability is. It's just hard to hide it and not change. Quick questions, and then go ahead.
In terms of policy, do you have any thoughts on states that are looking to make bug bounties illegal and essentially hacking illegal, like the state of Georgia is debating right now?
That seems unwise and unsustainable. Yeah, I mean, bug bounties are an unequivocal good in my mind. They don't pay enough to compete with the black market vulnerabilities, but still, like, hackers want to do good too. So even if they don't pay as much as the black market, you can't pass a law to stop hacking. It's not how the world works. That's my short reaction. It's an interesting thought. Let me keep moving, and we'll be able to save some time at the end for questions. Government surveillance, we talked about this a little bit because it came up naturally. Government lawful hacking is this idea that eventually we have this choice between letting law enforcement and intelligence services use vulnerabilities and effectively hack into individual targets using these vulnerabilities as a better long-term policy future than an encryption backdoor that we use against a bunch of people. There's reasons for that that basically involve court and due process. And all of this is expecting and assuming that the country that you're thinking about has due process of law. Only so much you can do with limiting government surveillance. You can't rely on due process of law. We have to set good examples in the countries that do have that in order to show how that leads to a better internet ecosystem and encourage others to follow suit. As soon as we get a country that we can point to as the moral leader of the internet sector again, that was done. Data localization data is actually a little bit of a beginning. This is a particularly big issue for us and one that we can grow over years to come as countries gain more and more awareness of what we can do with data, both for good and for nefarious purposes. They have more and more incentives to say, store all the data that we might want in our country so that we have the legal means to get it, and we don't have to rely on some of the very difficult to use existing treaties and international legal mechanisms to try to get data out of another country. Those mechanisms are hard and slow, and so that's what creates all of this controversy. So it's a larger conversation than I can give justice to now. But it fits into the jurisdictional as well. It gets back to this right to be forgotten story that I gave in France, and how jurisdiction and legal jurisdiction and the historical West End Nation status of political science involved the model of these authority and legitimacy within each state over a state, just the conclusion of that, and the technical global nature of the internet, and the desire of so many people in the engineering and the policy world, including me, to keep it global, to keep it effectively global, so that we can have an equality opportunity eventually, maybe in 100 years, or at least create more of an effective global conversation and harmonization by keeping it global. How that is legal jurisdiction ongoing. Let me move on because I have a whole other set of issues outside that trust fund. I'll try to wrap up a little bit less on these. This is a longer set, and don't worry, they go faster. I'll just dig right into them. Telecommunications is where I started my career. I started my career in policy work on net travel. Near and dear to my heart, has been for more than a decade right now. No need to wrap on that one. I'll give you the TLDR version. Net neutrality is a set of public policy and sometimes legal and regulatory obligations that say your provider of internet access, AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, something like that, is not allowed to pick and choose for you or speed up or slow down specific types of content, specific content providers, but that it is your free and open right to choose to use for the services that you want. No problem, blocking, no pay prioritization, fast lanes, no form of content or endpoint specific discrimination in the routing traffic. We have globally formed this, I think, at the normative level. The legal matter competition is my favorite issue right now. So I will probably deep dive a little bit on this. But you can't read the newspaper for very. It's very, very frequent to see tech issues come up around competition in the news space. And a lot of that's the 2020 Democratic presidential primary season. Senator Warren came out earlier this year and said we have to bring them up. And a lot of other things inspired from that. She was speaking to it back. She was speaking to a growing wave of organizations and people who see this concentrated power. These five companies that are typically the five biggest companies in the world that are capitalization. And the amount of control that they have over data, over networks, over your experience online. This is not the future of the internet that we hope for, to block out that strategy. It's something I'm deeply worried about, so I've worked on quite a lot over the past few years. In my mind, the nightmare scenario of the future of the internet is one where you don't get to pick and choose. You can get a technology stack that's delivered by Apple, or a technology stack delivered by Google, or a technology stack delivered by Microsoft, and all of your services on one of those companies. That's what the natural incentives play out. The economic theory on this is that these markets escape. They tend to favor centralization for four fundamental economic theory reasons. So if we need law to respond to that, market forces aren't going to do it. And it's hard to get to that law because we have decades of precedent driven by a misguided economic theory known as the Chicago School of Economics that led our antitrust law in the United States to never be a merger that was that's put us in a weird place. I wrote a behavior lab on Span, which is the counter narrative to that law. But regulators and policymakers around the world have finally started to really figure out that we need a significant change in direction. There were some great reports this early this year, 300-page reports, one coming out of London, one coming out of Brussels, the European Union, and one coming out of the United States that really laid out this case. And I've been with Mozilla trying to take this and channel this into a public policy. You can't take a 150-page economic report and put it in front of a staff or only one or two of them are going to understand that or wait for that. So we posted a white paper in September to try to translate this into what do we need to do with competition policies to make a more competitive, more open, more generative internet ecosystem. And our answer is interoperability, which let me tell you is hard to talk about wonky issues to the public, and when you can't think of a non-sentence of a word to do it, it's just even harder. I can't. I tried for 3 years and I'm still using the word interoperability. They get it back to the technology of how your internet experience is built and shaped. And hidden behind the surface of so many of these data flows and technology interactions is a specific thing called APIs, application programming interfaces. These APIs facilitate data share and operation and how Google Maps works on your Apple phone and how it interacts with so many different things. APIs are the secret sauce of the internet and what makes it fundamentally different from cable TV. Even within their silos, different services built by the same company use APIs to exchange data and communicate with each other. So I've been on a quest to educate policymakers on both sides of the internet to confidence. It's been a fascinating hour and a half on meeting with many senior staff at the Federal Trade Commission talking about APIs. Here's our perspective on how this works, why this is related to competition, and to unlock the internet ecosystem to a future of downstream innovation and broader choice and more opportunity, and to get it back to this vision that we're certainly not in anymore, where anybody with an idea can turn it into a product and offer it to the world. More just it's really an issue. I've got 2 questions already, I think, for this one. Yeah.
Competition, the affordability is a big problem.
Really good point. So the APIs can be part of that direction as well. And you all have probably heard of the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal. The Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal became a scandal because Facebook built a bad API. Like they actually were, I think, doing it at the beginning from a good instinct. They wanted to have a relatively more open API. Make more data available for researchers and others. It turns out it went too far. So we have to figure out how to calibrate this, how to calibrate an API so that it offers data necessary to secure tokens and mechanisms. But what we have to avoid is Facebook and others using privacy as a shield to be anti-competitive. If they're using privacy and security for anti-competitive behavior, for shutting down APIs, getting them back where they need to, because they're claiming to be worried about privacy and security. And in the process, building walls up on their silos, they're intellectual property is a nice little thing, copyright, patent. Copyright was one of those issues that really helped galvanize tech policy to become an ecosystem. I said I got into this field in law school because I was reading Larry Lessig. Larry Lessig was writing about copyright. He was writing about how copyright policy evolved line to software, to technology development. And some really fundamental cases around copyright law was written long before there was computer technology, right? Long before people were coding these principles, these legal customs around copyright law were put into American law. And there's a similar trajectory with different histories over Europe and other places all over. We've been fighting for a long time about how to take this antiquated law with decent underlying political principles, but it just doesn't fit tech very well. So the latest fight on this was in the European Union. In 2015 through earlier this year, the EU was looking at copyright reform as part of the digital single market agenda under the theory that they could take the 28 to 27 member states of the European Union and knit them together economically into a greater functioning unit. And that in order to do that, in order to facilitate a better flow of data and innovation and economic energy and so forth across Europe, one of many things they needed to do was harmonize the copyright laws of all the member states of the EU. That process got a little bit co-opted by some incompetent, non-tech, legacy political interests. And what you saw were a couple of articles that got added into the copyright reform package that ended up creating new limitations, new rights, new taxes, and costs imposed on innovators and tech companies in many ways. It was a massive fight for a very long time. It's also one of those fights where so often we're fighting against Facebook and Google and big tech companies. And this is what we're all all the interest organizations, big tech, small tech, everyone's on the same side. And we still lost because this fight is hard. Right? We don't have enough resources. We don't have enough people. So I hope by the end of this, by the way, that a few of you are so excited about the issues that you go. Here's more tech policy. We need more people working in this area and working at a proper world that you're all coming about this from a need a better applicable internet technology environment that reflects us all and channels us all into the fundamental governance decisions that we make about myself. Moving on to copyright patents. Patent law is an area that doesn't see a lot of policy activity right now, but it's still pretty important. And when I started at Mozilla and earlier in my career, I was far more interested in patents because the patent process. I spent one summer working in law in between my second and third years of law school, which is the typical time of law school to do it. And I did a lot of different kinds of work at that law firm. And I spent a week or two on patent prosecution, which is the part of the process by which you apply for a patent and try to get it. And I walked away from this to believing that the patent system is the most unjust piece of law in the entire America. The reason is this: if you're trained as a lawyer, if you get a patent check to make the most minimal changes possible to your patent application and then resubmit, do that 7 times, 8 times, the patent office in the U.S. is completely overworked. Roll the dice sometimes you're going to get some patent generators like I'm just tired of going. And that's how we got a ton of really bad technology patents. There's fundamental challenges in the system here. We had a really great Supreme Court case, halcyon CLS back a few years ago, that struck down a whole lot of these overly wrong patents. And we're still seeing the play out of that in the courts. If you're interested in this, I'm happy to talk about it more. But it's got to the point now where we actually got a really good turn in the law in the courts, which doesn't happen that often in tech. And so we're playing that out, getting a lot of these overbroad patents to be unenforced, struck down entirely, and making some good progress. Now, for one of these, probably the hardest issue that I'm working on right now, content regulation. How do we regulate bad content, bad activity online? And how do we do that in a way that tries to preserve the content online? It really took a new turn after 2016. And after all the news articles about Russian misinformation, honest misinformation, people who had nothing to do with the Russians or any form of organized anything, just had a political ideology found it reinforced by the filter bubble that they were in online. And then spread this false hope. The amount of credibility that Hillary Clinton and Jim Podesta were running the whole history, still scarred, still bitter, but there's a lot of this stuff online, and a lot of it's online because we build a framework that maximalizes free expression all around the world and doesn't have anything that is reasonable and balanced to hold companies accountable and to make them responsible for their role as intermediaries of user-generated content online. This is a really difficult balance. I heard a piece about this a couple years ago, and it feels like it's blocking the edge of the national trend. You follow on one side, and you're allowing too much harm, too much abuse. You follow on the other, and you're cutting off legitimate political activists, legitimate civil rights. It's really, really hard to balance, right? But what we have now is very proxy partners and politicians from every corner, left and right in the US, from every different country in Europe, every party in Europe, all saying that we need to go after big tech companies. So it's going to be really messy and a really challenging fight to try to figure out how to walk this very, very narrow balance and try to make some meaningful progress on willful and organized disinformation by big campaigns, intentionally creating fake images, fake videos, spreading them through the system, and then the organic disinformation layer that surrounds that makes the problem so much bigger. Trying to make progress on that is going to be really, really hard. So that's why it's the most important issue that many people in tech policy are working on right now. So talk a lot more about that, but I don't even want to talk about it. I want to make sure there's some time for questions. Trade, I would just go over pretty quickly. A lot comes up in trade. Trade is really fascinating for a couple years because it's incredibly powerful, galvanizing force for public engagement on tech policy issues. Trade processes happen behind closed doors, in secret, shadowy rich people rooms, like carrying out these trade deals that set legal frameworks for quite some time. Europe didn't like that in particular. Huge protests all across Europe in the anti-counterfeiting and trade. It's been a really nice fascinating project. There's also other pieces that go into that, but long term, I think the real underlying challenge in trade is how the trade agreements are set behind those doors without public process, and how unjust and undemocratic it feels to have questions as difficult as all the ones I just talked about being resolved through non-transparent processes. Okay, a couple of issues that I didn't get a chance to talk about because they cross this sort of crossed barrier. Internet governance is another one of those things that pops up every few years. It's a little quiet now, but who is in charge? It's more complicated than that, but every now and then you get new governments making some noise in the UN, the United Nations to govern the internet. That is a bad idea for a lot of reasons, but it does come up every now and then. Internet governance is very severe right now. It's artificial intelligence, again, taking a topic that we talked about hours on. Artificial intelligence is not one issue, it's many issues. It's the use of AI by local governments to build formal human functions that ends up reintroducing discrimination and bias in ways. It's the way Facebook reorders your newsfeed and how that contributes to misinformation and manipulation without you having any insight into it or understanding. It's the way that YouTube recommends content where you can go down 3 paths of recommendation and get something completely innocuous to straight up propaganda. Right? And it's the effort that these companies are actually trying to make to improve this, but they're doing it reinventing both sides of the platform. We're not talking about it, we're not talking about it together. We don't need trust in AI systems, like everything. And that's a problem. AI can be a force for good. If you can figure out how to approach it in a more transparent and more accountable way, and bring people into the loop and shape how the underlying algorithms are built and what kinds of data goes into them, and open this all up a little bit more. I refuse to believe in the future where we shut down all the AI because it has so much potential for good, but there's a long ways between here and there. And a lot of we need governments to do is fulfill this original vision of mine to be good and not bad. Oh, other stuff I didn't mention. Just for complexity, like there are a lot of people who do tech policy in organizations like mine that do things that I don't really consider tech policy, tax policy, taxation of low income paying countries, immigration policy is a very, very big deal for many companies. Land use and zoning ends up being a factor for a lot of different companies like Airbnb. Energy policies play out with it. So you see it's even broader universe than we already brought universe that is around you. But those are a little further.
editorializing, and that they seem to kind of trying to walk this line of not being, it puts them in a different sort of legal kind of footing, their editorializing.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah.
How we can find our way out of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a sticky situation than a legal one, because the law, as it has been designed in both the USA and Europe, was built to allow them to cultivate content and to filter for content and to do re-rating. Like, it was built expressly to allow them to be sort of publishers-like without exposing them to liability. And so a lot of this rhetoric we see right now, like, oh, they're being publishers, let's take that, we'll see how we're doing. It's a little bit tricky. But it is tricky to know at what level of cultivation do we feel that conceptually they are starting to act more like publishers than they are neutral intermediaries. But that is the kind of broken binary choice that ranks policy conversations. It's not either, and it's very problematic if you insist on going into a nuanced and complex policy conversation by saying there are either neutral intermediaries or they're publishers. Either we regulate the hell out of them or we just let them be. Like, it has to be something in the middle, because the reality of what we do is I think so.
Hi, so I had a simple question which led me to a little bit more of a complex one. It was about how you were talking about revocability and privacy, and I was wondering exactly what revocability meant, which led me to kind of ask, how do you define these words and languages for everyday users? I'm very new to tech, so I still don't know a lot of the terminology around tech. How do you make sure users know exactly what they're agreeing to, just purely based on language?
That is a fun hobby of mine. I wrote a paper when I was in law school for the undergraduate. I was doing a cognitive framing based on linguistic analysis of communication. And the ways in which, there was a particular case that I focused on, I focused on a couple, but the Grokster case, copyright law, for the Ninth Circuit and the Supreme Court. The way the copyright industry argued that the Grokster technology platform was a violation of the law, in the Ninth Circuit they had this very dry technical legal argument, and they lost. The Supreme Court brief used some variant of the word infringement that at times just 2 pages. Language is incredibly powerful, it's incredibly poorly defined. The most potent tool in the policy advocate's toolbox. And it's not, there's no like written definition that would ever be imported because everybody comes to different sources of truth. It's about finding the right language that captures where people are coming from, taps into how they're viewing the world of technology. We talk about things being translated through a lot of messaging, a lot of blog posts over a very long period of time. You have to build up a public understanding of the concept of revocability or interoperability. You have to work over a long period of time, and I made a conscious effort in Mozilla's work around interoperability to just keep saying that phrase and keep putting it in good context. Like interoperability is what unlocks the future innovation narrative. You have to frame the words that you want to frame to get them to be understood in the way that they matter and that they need to be. But it is, for revocability, it's just the ability to use your phone and say, that consent that I'm being used to hold my phone number, I revoke it, you have to delete my phone number. So that's the technical concept, like how do you do that from them? It just takes time to do that position. If anybody's interested in this, George Lakoff, the developer book, because he was my key version. So this is like 80 pages long, super easy, super fun read it, blow your mind. Yes.
Hi, my name is Aaron. I'm an ex-Obama campaign staffer and comes to North so I love all the notes on Larry Lessig and everything else. I was working with Susan Levin for Triage AI, working on my second book, particularly on this issue with regard to privacy and particle design and spatial computing. My questions on actually decentralization as a choice, giving more options for choice. For example, the Brave browser, which I guess was founded by the co-founder of Mozilla, but it's built on top of Chromium, which is Google. I wanted to know your thoughts and approaches to that, especially with regards to other things like blockchain. So if you see, like, I don't know, people talk about blockchain voting, different things like Silicon Valley HBO or billions. I'm curious to know about it because the public could be about, well, if we decentralize things or have this other options, we can do that to sort of like regain the public's trust. But I feel like for internationalization and things outside of Silicon Valley, like if we look at Myanmar or other places in the world, if Facebook or any of these other, the big 5 companies are the only option, how do we educate the public about other options that are actually more along the lines of a decentralized framework?
Yeah, no, so there's a lot of questions there, but I can give you a pretty concise answer that gets most of them. I've always been skeptical of cryptocurrencies. I think that particularly proof of work-based cryptocurrencies that require you to run computer cycles for a little while in order to generate a virtual token are so incredibly terrible to the environment. However, cryptocurrencies thing, it has resulted in a generation of a lot of wealth, and a lot of that wealth is the engineering of decentralized alternatives to existing software services. That is incredibly good. I went to the Decentralized Web Summit here in San Francisco last year, and there's a powerful community there, and I have more hope in the future of decentralized technology as a counterforce to the political power, the technological driving power of today's consumer companies than anything else. So I am all for the decentralized movement. And how do we get that better? Well, we need to figure out 2 things. First of all, we need to build good products. Like, the reason why Mozilla is a $100 million a year based organization that employs over 1,000 people is it's actually really hard to build good products. And you can't get a small team of people to hack something together and have it be a good product for a large scale of users. So we have to figure out how to channel resources in the right way to build really good products. And we have to get interoperability to crack into the data and the networks that are being controlled by the companies so that we can make the things that would work an effective way for people who are fed up with Facebook to actually go somewhere else and not have to start all over. Not have to start all over as we do for friends and recruit a critical mass of people to go try Mastodon. We need to get to a future where they can use Mastodon and Facebook together so that we can create that glide path to it.
One more question, and then it's time for lunch. And I know there are more questions, but I hope Chris will stick around so that you can continue to ask him your questions. And I'm just going to make the reminder about lunch again. We put some signs up on the table for more coming. So please get up and around to choose a topic of interest. Also, you're welcome to move the chairs around. You can pull up more chairs to our table. But not question.
Awesome, real quick question. Questions about accountability. I know for some of us who had read your gap description, she was discussed, all of that. Employees are officially intelligence programs, who's full accountable. So what are your thoughts from your perspective? Are we actually going to doomsday with no accountability on the tech companies, small or big, or whatever computer scientists that are employees of artificial intelligence programs?
So I'm definitely not a doomsdayer. I think that the tech industry can take its own a big move for itself by thinking that AI is the solution to everything. There's problems with AI, obviously. I do think that things are trending in a good direction, and there's some small examples of that that need to be done. Right? So YouTube, for example, notorious for recommending continuously bad content. Put up a blog post earlier this year with like for certain types of content, we are taking out the engagement factor as part of the classification of recommendations. We're putting in a different factor around authoritativeness, source. They made that change. They talked about that. I don't know if that's the right change, but they're trying to make changes, and they are talking about it a little bit. And they will try harder and make more changes and talk about it more. And everyone wants to do that too. I do believe it's and I think that we will eventually. I think we have to. Thank you. Right, on your property.